All right, class, welcome. Welcome to week 10. This week we're going to be starting chapter 8, and we'll finish chapter 8 next week. So that's the good news. There's no exam for the chapter this week. Next week's exam will cover both weeks of material. As we look forward into the upcoming weeks, make sure you are looking at the written assignment that is due in just a couple weeks. I know it's still a couple weeks away, but it always helps to take a look at it, and better sooner than later to get started on it. Let's dive right into chapter 8 now. Chapter 8 uses an umbrella term called consequentialism. And that's really just a fancy way of saying the end justifies the means. What they're saying is your decisions, your actions are neither good nor bad. What makes them a good decision or a good action is as long as they result in good things. If you make a good decision, that means that the results of your decision had good benefits to somebody, yourself or society, something like that. Within that umbrella term of consequentialism is utilitarianism, and that kind of expounds on that theory and says that again, ideas, decisions, and actions are neither good nor bad, but it includes the negative aspect. So whereas consequentialism says your actions are good as long as they have good benefits at the end, utilitarianism says that you can make a bad decision, and that happens if your bad decision has negative consequences. So the whole goal of utilitarianism is to maximize the benefits of your decisions and minimize the consequences. So how does that apply to the criminal justice world? How can we give a scenario or come up with a scenario where a decision is neither good nor bad? And one of the things that I was thinking about was speeding. We talked about that last week. So if you call the police because someone is broken into your house, you're locked in the bedroom and you have an intruder in your house in the middle of the night, how quickly do you want the police to get there? I would imagine pretty quickly. Do you want them to speed? Do you want them to break those speed laws? Do you want them to use their lights and sirens and get there as fast as possible? Probably. I think most people would say yes. Well, speeding is inherently, one, in general, is illegal. Obviously, there's exceptions for those using lights and sirens. And two, it's dangerous. So how does that speeding to get to the burglary suspect, the intruder, benefit society? Well, the obvious answer is it's going to benefit you. It's going to keep you and your family safe. So it's that balance test, that weight test that we talked about, where you want to maximize the benefit but minimize the consequence. So as long as someone can safely respond using those lights and sirens, a law enforcement officer can safely respond using those lights and sirens, get to the scene of a crime in progress, and then stop that crime in progress and keep that family safe, there has been no negative consequence. There's been no collision, nobody was hurt, and in fact, somebody was saved. So that's a good example of that balance test of utilitarianism, where you've now, although the decision to speed is inherently a negative, we don't want people to speed on the highways and drive unsafely, but the benefit of that unsafe per se, driving outweighs the consequences of the driving. So let me take that one step further and put yourself in the place of a supervisor or a manager in a law enforcement agency. If you are supervising your officers and your officers are authorized to use their lights and sirens for radio calls and responding to emergencies, and you start noticing an uptick in traffic collisions amongst your officers, how would you handle that? At some point, there's going to be that shift in that balance test. At some point, the unsafe driving, the consequences of the unsafe driving have overtaken the benefits of achieving or responding to those calls as quickly as possible. And you need to make a decision as a manager or as a supervisor within the law enforcement agency on how you're going to handle your officer, how you're going to manage your officers. Are you going to counsel them? Are you going to send them to additional driving training? Are you going to restrict their driving? Are you going to make them ride with somebody else and have somebody else drive? There's a lot of different decisions that supervisors have and options that they have, but think about how you would handle those. So this week, going back to utilitarianism. This week, the the discussion board asks you to post your thoughts on how utilitarianism applies to the plea bargaining system within courts. So before we get too deep into that, let's talk about what a plea bargain is. So a plea bargain is a decision between the prosecution and the defense on how to come to a disposition of a case, usually in exchange for a guilty or a no contest plea from the defendant. The prosecution will either lower the penalty or remove additional charges, which would essentially lower the penalty. So in exchange for a better sentence in the eyes of the defendant, a lesser sentence, in exchange for a lesser sentence, the defendant will agree to forego the trial and plead guilty or no contest. And that will essentially end that part of the exposure in the criminal justice system. About 90% of all cases are pled out. If we didn't have plea bargains in in the American criminal justice system, we'd be completely overloaded. You hear a lot about the overload as is now, and that's with a 90% rate of plea bargaining. Imagine taking that and getting rid of the plea bargains and forcing every single trial to go to its full length, months and months, sometimes years. It would just cripple our criminal justice and cripple our court system. So it's a necessary component of the court system, but we have to think about who is involved, who are the actors, who are the players in the plea bargain. So the book and I, when I talk about this subject, there's 4 different parties that we come up with. But if you can think of any others, then by all means include them in your post. But the 4 that come to mind are the prosecutor, the defense, the victim, and the community. Let's just talk about those real quick. The prosecutor, they're involved. When you make a decision to initiate or accept a plea bargain, again, you're using utilitarianism, and it has to be the decision is only good if it maximizes the benefit and minimizes the consequence. So how do we do that? How do we examine that and analyze whether or not the benefit is outweighing the consequence? Well, first of all, the prosecutor, we just said they have to plea bargain out up to 90% of their cases. So it's going to benefit the court system, it's going to benefit their caseload, and it's going to allow them to concentrate their efforts on the most serious cases. So that there's a benefit. There's some consequence as well. And that consequence is that there's a lowering in penalties. So society, the prosecutor, all the parties involved have to decide, do those benefits outweigh the consequence? Going on to the defense is having obviously a benefit in this decision because they're having their penalty lowered. They're also having their exposure in court as far as time and labor. The attorney is able to move on to other clients. If it is a private attorney and the defendant is paying for it, then the hourly rate is, or excuse me, not the hourly rate, but the final bill, the hours worked are going to be less. So the cost of the attorney is going to be reduced, thereby helping the defendant if they plead guilty sooner than later. The cost of their defense will be a benefit. The consequence to them, I imagine, would be something along the lines of, maybe you never know what a jury is going to do. So maybe they would have been found innocent. So it's a little bit of a gamble there. So you have to, again, weigh it out. Decide whether or not the benefits of saving money, saving time, getting a reduced penalty now, as opposed to the gamble of maybe a jury would find you guilty and give you a more harsh penalty, or you had been found guilty on more charges. Weigh that against perhaps there would have been a finding of innocent or not guilty, excuse me. Moving on to the victim. Why is the victim involved? Should the victim get a say? I mean, I'd like to hear about that in your post this week. Should the victim of a crime have some bearing and some power in the decision-making process of whether or not a plea bargain occurs? If you're a victim of a crime, I imagine any of us as a victim of a crime would want to have some say and decide. As it stands now, there's no veto power on a victim. A victim can't override a plea bargain. The the bargain is between the prosecution and the defense. Although the victim often is given a say, in the end, unfortunately, a victim can be overruled and a victim can't overrule the decision. But how, what's the benefit and what's the consequence in there as the victim is making a decision to give their input? Well, the benefit a lot of times is, especially in sensitive cases, juvenile cases, sexual assault cases, things like that. The benefit of accepting a plea bargain is, for having the defendant accept a plea bargain, is that they don't have to testify. So think about some really heinous crimes, and when I was a detective, I worked in our sexual assault section, and I had a lot of crimes, a lot of really heinous sexual assault crimes that I felt horrible for the victim. A, that it even occurred, and B, now they had to relive that with me. We had to sit down and talk about all the details. They've already talked about it with the initial responding officers. So now they've lived it. They told the responding officers. Now, as a detective, they're going through it again. There may be a pre-trial meeting where they go through it with the prosecutor and some sort of victim advocate. And then on top of all that, now going to a courtroom and reliving that entire experience step by step, not only in a friendly environment, a welcoming environment, a comforting environment like they've seen thus far, but remember that courtrooms are an adversarial style of environment. So you're going to tell your story as a victim, and then your story is going to be challenged by the defense. So that is a uncomfortable, to say the least, situation. So having a victim be able to avoid that experience is a benefit in itself. And obviously, the consequences of the plea bargain would be that perhaps there's a lower level of justice, if you will. The victim isn't quite as restored if the bargain gives the defense a better deal than perhaps they would have gotten in a trial. So again, weigh that. When the victim gives their input, they need to weigh that. And then finally, the community. The community should have some input, whether it be through their, how are they going to actually get that input into the court system? Through elections. Electing the judges. Judges are usually elected positions, and so are district attorneys. While those who actually prosecute the cases are employees of the district attorney, they're by proxy a representative of those who are elected. So district attorneys will be elected by the public at large, and they will run on a stance of a very heavy-handed against crime or a very restorative justice style of prosecution. If you look at where I'm at now in Los Angeles, we have a brand new district attorney, George Gascon, and George Gascon has implemented a lot of policies that are that run counter to district attorneys in the area, where usually the going rate, the usual outlook on crime is we're going to put as people in jail as long as we can to protect society. Whereas George Gascon, as a brand new DA in Los Angeles County, has taken the stance that we need to save the county money and we need to avoid recidivism by using restorative justice and rehabilitation to keep people on the streets instead of in jail. So he has implemented some policies that will lower jail sentences, that will release the criminals sooner than they would have been, things like that, because it's his opinion, his theory that that is the best course of action for the community. So the community elected DA Gascon because of those policies. So those policies are being implemented. That's how the community has a say. So when the community does have a say on how they want their offenders to be treated, you have to remember there's four reasons why we incarcerate folks: deterrence, incapacitation, rehabilitation, and retribution. So deterrence being, if you commit this crime, you're going to jail, so you don't want to commit this crime. You're being deterred from committing a crime based solely on the fact that there's going to be some consequence. Incapacitation being that if we put somebody in jail, then they can't commit crimes. They're incapacitated from their criminal behavior. So the more time someone spends in jail, the less time they're able to victimize the community. Rehabilitation being kind of what I talked about with DA Gascon being, if you provide programs, education, parole, things that will get somebody back on the streets sooner to become an effective member of society, then they won't need to offend, and they won't necessarily want to offend, and recidivism in this theory would go down. And then retribution being essentially punishment. When we talk about how the victim wants to have a say in the plea bargain, part of what a lot of victims factor in their decision-making process is, I've been wronged, so it's only fair for the offender to be wronged. And that's what retribution is. It's a punishment for doing somebody wrong. So take what we've discussed here in this video and apply it to your posts. Make sure that you give the proper number of citations. One of the reasons I do these videos is to give you an absolutely easy citation. So you have the book, which is one reference, and you can use these videos, reference these videos, and there's your two. Now you have two citations. You get full credit for your reference points, which is 20 points, significant. If you don't use citations, your grade automatically drops down to an 80. So it only goes down from there. So you use the video, use the book, use any outside sources, get full credit, because I want to see you use more of a global thought process than just, this is what I think. Tell me, this is what I think based on what I read in the book, what I saw in a video, what I saw in this article, things like that. So I look forward to seeing your posts this week. And if you have any questions, as always, reach out to me and we can discuss them.